right, let's get to a fantastic conversation next. A US trade negotiation team reportedly extended its stay in India by 4 days to today. According to Bloomberg, negotiators now expect most issues to have been finalised within a matter of days. The discussions come as part of a phased effort to seal a limited trade agreement before so-called reciprocal tariffs on Indian exports come into effect next month. I think you could argue that India is one of the most fascinating countries on the planet in many ways, but also in terms of its relationship with the United States. Let's get to this conversation with Sumant, who is founder, chairman and CEO of Renew. Always great to see you. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Steve. Thank you so much for having me.
I think India, I've just said it, so I won't say it again. It's because, let me give you a good example. Apple says, right, we're going to get away from the Trump ire, the anger about the relationship between China and the United States, between the huge export imbalance. We're going to go to India and make our phones, and that will sort the problem out as well. Because India, fantastic market. All right, we're going to have to do a lot of work to get the fabrication going, to train the workers, but it will solve all the problems. And then the US says, no. Trump says, no, that's not. So the way that this goes at both a country-to-country level and a company level and how they use India and work within India, I think it's unbelievably fascinating. I don't think you're going to disagree.
No, not at all. And I think the big advantage that India brings is a massive domestic market. We are now the fifth, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years, becoming the third largest economy in the world. And we are growing at about 7 to 8% every year, with a massive population of now the largest in the world of 1.4 billion people. So it's a massive domestic market, and I think it's a big prize for any multinational global firm which is looking for future growth opportunities. So I think that's a big advantage that we as a country bring to bear. But on top of that, there's a very clear effort on the part of the government to really integrate India into global supply chains. Because obviously we want to become a much bigger manufacturing country than we are right now. India has always been a leader on the services side, but I think manufacturing is the next big frontier that the Indian government wants to deal with.
We all get that around this desk as well. It is so obvious. And yet the administration is looking to bring those jobs back to the United States. How does India answer those problems when actually it's not about friendshoring, it's about completely reshoring?
Look, I think that the world is a very complex place right now. I think every country is trying to reshore manufacturing into their own country, and I think that's particularly being strongly done by the US. But I think a lot of other countries around the world are looking to find good diversification opportunities, on their supply chain from China. Look at the clean energy supply chain, for example, where China has a lock on a number of products. But India has really been actively now developing a big clean energy supply chain. So we as a company, for example, have set up a 6,000 megawatt solar manufacturing plant, which now there's a whole ecosystem of manufacturing developing in India, which therefore allows India to start exporting to other parts of the world and really create the +1 to China that the world is looking for. Now, will that at times clash with other countries, reshoring plans, as in the example that you gave? It might, but I think countries have to get together and work through some of those things, and I think that'll happen.
There's no doubt about it that India has a huge incentive to shift toward cleaner energies. I mean, I've spent a couple of Decembers in Delhi just after Diwali, and the pollution levels are just sky high. It's dangerous, and it's a crucial challenge here. What are some of the biggest challenges, though, in developing clean energy in India?
You're absolutely right that India definitely has a big pollution problem, especially in the time of the year that you're talking about. And in a way, that is creating a lot of domestic consensus that we need to, as a country, move forward on our clean energy ambitions, because that's one way, and a very important way, to clean up the whole, all the cities and the country as a whole on the pollution side, which is why there's also a big push now for electric vehicles. So there's a lot of consensus around that. Now, what the government is doing is, one big step forward is to really make sure that all the incremental energy demand that we require gets met mostly from clean energy sources, mostly wind and solar, for example. But I think in the future, it'll also include things like green hydrogen, nuclear, and so on. Along with that, we need to make sure that the grid in India expands really rapidly. And the good thing in India is that we have a single national grid, which means that you can take the power from anywhere in the country to any other part of the country without a problem. Most other parts of the world don't have that big advantage. You know, the US, for example, is 7 different grids. Europe is also pretty fragmented. So India has that massive advantage. The other thing that we are working on right now as a country is now storage. And we are now looking at much higher amounts of battery storage and also pumped hydro storage. And all of that will give flexibility to the grid, which will essentially allow us to then add this 500 gigawatts. But you know what is really interesting is not just the target that we have for 2030, but for 2047, which is not that far away now, it's only 20 years, we have to add almost 2,000 gigawatts of new clean energy capacity, renewable energy capacity. And just to give you a sense of context, that is twice the entire installed capacity in the US of all forms of electricity.
I mean, all of those ambitions sound excellent. I mean, you talk about there being consensus within India that all of these changes you just described are needed, but clearly there are some pretty huge challenges as well. So, you know, just shed a little bit more light on what those barriers to actually fulfilling these ambitions look like.
Yeah, look, I think that when you have such a massive and ambitious plan, you will obviously have issues that you have to tackle at the same time. One is grid build-out is something that has to go commensurate with this huge generation build-out that we're going to have. And it's not just building out the grid, it's also managing the grid. And you know, we don't want to have things like happen in Spain and Portugal recently where you have a blackout and so on. So you need to build a lot of flexibility into the grid. And both of those, generation and flexibility and grid build-out, have to go hand in hand. The second big limiting factor is access to land, because obviously renewable energy needs a lot of land. And you know, there you come across issues with other uses of land, and those can be difficult sometimes to deal with. But I think those are the two primary challenges. Of course, capital is something that we all require as well, because this program will require trillions of dollars of capital over the next several years, you know, several hundreds of billions of dollars every year. But my sense is that with the regulatory environment that we have now in India, which is very attractive for overseas capital to come in as well as domestic capital, there's a lot of interest in India right now on investing in the clean energy space. And so, for example, we talk to so many investors around the world, whether it's you know, multilateral investors. Just the other day, we had an investment from the British International Investments, which is the UK's government investing arm in emerging markets on things like climate change. They've invested $100 million into our solar manufacturing plant. So I think you're seeing a lot of diverse interest in all parts of the supply chain and the value chain right now.
We've only got time for, I think, one more question. We might try and squeeze two in. But you just mentioned about that investment into Indian solar manufacturing as well. It touched upon a question I was going to ask you anyway about the relationship between India and China. We don't talk a lot about it. We talk about the relationship between the US and India, US and China, etc., etc. It's a very complicated regional superpower confrontation potentially, and we know there's been kind of, you know, some hot issues in the Himalayas, but actually by and large it's about economic competition as well at the moment as well. But also in terms of, like you mentioned, the growth of the solar industry as well, that's reliant still on cheap Chinese solar panels, isn't it?
It is getting less reliant on solar panels, but it is still dependent on solar wafers, because we're now importing wafers and making cells and modules in
Chinese
India.
wafers.
But they still are. I think over time, give us another 5 to 7 years with government policies in place, I think that we will start making wafers and polysilicon as well in India eventually. The idea is also to make batteries.
Sorry, sir.
Yeah.
Why would it be, and it's the same question us Europeans ask all the time, why would it be competitive economically to produce them in India rather than buying them from China? Or is that not the issue? It's about security.
No, that's a great question. But in India, it's clearly a question of security. As you said, there are a lot of geopolitical issues at play between India and China. India does not want to move its energy reliance, let's say, on oil exporting countries for our energy imports suddenly to China for solar panel imports, because that's not going to really get us very far on the security side. And so that's why the government has now put in place non-tariff barriers, which essentially prevent the import of any solar panels or solar cells into the country. So we actually have a pretty hard wall on importing those items. And that's the kind of thing that we require. We need very specific, proactive, clear policies to and which need to be there for some time. Because otherwise, you're right, people are just going to keep importing the cheap stuff And the cheap stuff is not necessarily bad stuff, let me say. It's good stuff. But the fact is, you'll never then develop a domestic manufacturing industry, and you'll never have the +1 to China. So India's taken this very strong view on solar imports, and eventually the idea is to develop the entire clean energy supply chain in the country.
A fascinating conversation. Thank you for the insight on what is a huge part of the world. Really appreciate you joining us. Sumant Sinha, founder, chairman, and CEO of Renew.